welcome to the panel on critical reflections on citizenship and belonging. Like Susan said, my name is Jennifer Lugris, and I will be introducing you to the panelists. After their presentations, there will be time for Q&A. So our first presenter is Stephen James. Stephen James is an American-born British dual national who has worked in the Philippines, Soviet Central Asia, England, Switzerland, and Germany. He was raised in Vietnam during the Vietnam-American War era and is completing a PhD in anthropology at UC Riverside, focused on experiences of multiple forced migrations amongst Chinese background Vietnamese in London, England. Our second presenter today is Ariane M. Schultz. Ariane M. Schultz is a recent PhD from UC Riverside's Department of Anthropology. Her research on cultural citizenship in the Erasmus program is funded by the Center for Ideas and Society, German Academic Exchange Services, CSU's Chancellor's Doctoral Initiative Fellowship, UC Riverside Graduate Division, and UC Riverside Department of Anthropology. Finally, our third presenter, Matthew Alvarez, is an undergraduate psychology student at UC Merced, expected to graduate this December. He published a piece on weight discrimination in the UC Merced Undergraduate Research Journal. He is also a UROC Humanities Research Scholar funded by the Andrew M. Mellon Foundation studying political advertising and emotion. He is an activist for social justice and aspires to receive a PhD in psychology. Please join me in welcoming our first presenter, Stephen James.
Thank you all for coming. It's great to see you early in the morning. What I'd like to do, first of all, is just say a few words about the conference. Humanities as an academic discipline is necessarily embedded in the realm of theory, and often we stay in that realm too often, I think. But as it's essential, it's also, there's that practical aspect that we do need the humanities in order to engage issues relevant to society. I'm grateful for the organizers of this conference, you guys, for taking this time and providing a space, really, for us to engage in dialogue. And as an anthropologist with a deep interest in the application of my field to social issues, particularly related to migration, a pertinent issue today in our world, I'm really grateful for this space, so thank you for organizing and inviting us. As we begin, while the humanities serves a role in cultivating community and citizenship, it also has to critique those communities and citizenship. It's important, I think, that there are insiders and outsiders when we think about citizenship. And I appreciated what you said and what was said yesterday in terms of the healing aspect and the sort of cathartic aspect that the humanities brings often to, not just to the academy, but to the outside world as well. So what I'd like to focus on today is this insider-outsider aspect of citizenship and look at it through the lens, really, of Chinese background Vietnamese. It may sound a bit obscure, Chinese background Vietnamese, but what I'd like to do is put it in a context in today's world where we have Syrians and we have Sudanese and Lebanese and others who are leaving their countries to second places and then being moved on often to Europe or to the US or to Canada or Australia. And they're finding themselves forced multiple times out of their worlds. And these are the people that I've spent the better part of the last decade or 15 years with. My intent is really not to examine the notion of community and citizenship from a political, a civic, or even a policy point of view, but really to look at the nature of citizenship and community attachments through the lens of interviewees themselves, of people who have lived these lives. That's that anthropological focus. And so I've used ethnography, I've used participant observation, and a number of different settings in London and Hong Kong in order to get at these stories and to understand them. I have to add my own positionality to that because it makes a difference, doesn't it? When we interact with people in an ethnographic way, we bring ourselves into that picture. We can't stand objectively above them or outside of them. And so as you heard in the intro, I was brought up in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, American War, and experienced the 1975 exodus. We left everything in our family home, and left in April of 1975 along with many others. This project, however, I'm keen to point out, is One of the aspects of the project is to point out that the boat migration to Hong Kong, some 200,000 people, was actually not a result of the Vietnam War. Often in journalist articles and other things you hear that, the boat people of the result of the Cold War. And in fact, these people that I'm talking about arrived in Hong Kong through a circuitous journey as a result of the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1978. I'm not sure, let me ask a hands. How many of you heard of the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1978? Not many, and this is one of my points, I guess, is to bring this out. Essentially, Chinese have been living in Vietnam for many, well, probably 2,000 years, 2,500 years, in the Vietnam area. Most recently, many Chinese have come to Vietnam generations back, settled, taken citizenship, and have been a part of the process and the program for many, many years. In 1978, Pol Pot Pol Pot was at its height. And there was a fear in 78, 79 that he was going to invade the southern part of Vietnam to take territory that had been taken some 900 years before by the Vietnamese. In addition, the Chinese were amassing troops on the northern border of Vietnam as a result of Vietnam's policy against Pol Pot in Cambodia, now Cambodia. And the idea was that perhaps the Chinese in Vietnam would rise up as, in a sense, a third army against the Vietnamese. And so there began a process of persecution and a heavy-handedness toward Chinese in Vietnam, even Vietnamese citizens who had Chinese backgrounds. So this is the context in which my research has been taking place. And so what I'd like to do is come back to this context of 1979 border war, the 78 invasion of Cambodia, when Vietnam actually entered Cambodia against China's wishes, and then China invaded Vietnam from the north. And talk about these 200,000 people who left. And what I'd like to do at this point is perhaps give you an audio. So I have audio scapes rather than a PowerPoint, if that's okay. I hope you can understand what Lam is saying, but let's just try it and see how we go. This is his explanation of why his family had to leave Vietnam, northern Vietnam.
Well, a bit more between the journey from Vietnam to China.
Right.
So,
and feel free to eat as you go.
I'm worried about the background noise.
You'll be okay. Just you can stop for a few minutes, and you tell the story,
okay,
and then we'll stop for a minute, eat, and then we'll go again. All right.
So, my parents, after they, at that time, I guess things are a little bit unfair to them. The Vietnamese government keeps sacking Chinese officials. So that was an indication to a lot of Chinese that the Vietnamese are starting to discriminate. So my parents, they had plans to build houses in Vietnam. In fact, my uncle, who are the older brother of my dad, has already halfway completed building his house. It says those that, just like grandson, they build it from scratch. And because of the evacuation, everything has to be left behind. Within one night, they lost everything. Like all their life investment, comes to nothing.
Wow. So I'll leave it there. And what Lam is saying is essentially overnight, he and his family were removed, evacuated, as he said. He used the word evacuation. Many others were doing the same thing. There was pressure on Chinese in Vietnam at that time. And so to contextualize it, effectively what was happening is there wasn't an actual central government policy. It was more someone would come to you at night and say, listen, it's not good for you now. It's probably better if you leave. And people would pack up and leave. or the police would come to a student who I interviewed, and she told me they would come every day, and they would come in my class. I was an architectural student in my 3rd year, and she said they would come and they would say, "When are you going to come by the police station? We need to talk." And she would say, "Oh, I'll be there," and she said, "Of course I wouldn't go." But then they would come and say, "How do you feel about this Chinese invasion of our borders?" And she would say, "Well, I feel like all the other Vietnamese in Vietnam, I'm concerned about this." And they would say, "Oh, well, you should come by and talk to us about this." Anyway, eventually she lost her place in college, they lost their home, and she finally bought passage on a boat to Vietnam. But one of the things I wanted to point out is this circuitous route. Lam and his family went from Vietnam, crossed the border, the river, into China, were there for 2 years, settled on a cooperative farm, worked for 2 years, hard labor. Then they finally were able to get passage on a boat to Hong Kong. They were in Hong Kong in a refugee camp for another 2 years, and then eventually, because of the handover of Hong Kong or from Britain to China in 1997, the Chinese said, "We will not inherit this Vietnamese problem, so you're going to have to move these 200,000 people on." About 60,000 were repatriated, and if you know Vietnamese history, this was problematic. But also, if you know refugee history, it's also against the UN Refugee Charter. Its policy of following is you are not to return people who are afraid for their lives. Lots of issues, lots of issues. So what I'd like to do now is to go back to this concept of security and citizenship. So just as yesterday we heard late in the day, this idea of the Hobbesian notion of security is guaranteed by the sovereign. We talked a bit about that in Hobbes' writings. And the concept is instilled, in a sense, a reified notion of belonging to the nation that's come to be known as the secure right to citizenship. And most would consider this right permanent. And indeed, debates around, first or second class citizens notwithstanding, everyone considers citizenship to be something that cannot be taken away. Sadly, it can be. It's this essentialized notion of citizenship that I want to question. And so my real question, research-wise, is what are the long-term effects of 40 years of settlement in Britain after having citizenship taken and then going through a process of migration through multiple forced migrations. And now the Vietnamese have settled in Britain for 40 years. So in this paper, I argue that one of the major effects of multiple forced migrations and the resulting serial migration from Vietnam through China, Hong Kong, and eventually to London, England, are new forms of attachment and belonging that reveal communities based not on citizenship, but on a shared history. They're based on shared values and shared communication, something that Susan Ostman describes as the poetics of attachment, a beautiful term. Describing the mobilities of what are called serial migrants, Ostman notes that people who settle for some period of time in more than 2 countries can be considered serial migrants, and they experience everyday life belonging to any number of different communities as compared to those who migrate to one location and settle permanently. Apropos to the Vietnamese experience, Iris Kalka describes its multiplicity of belongings amongst South Asians in London, and she says that the people had a stock of overlapping ethnic allegiances at their disposal to reinforce various claims. They evidently entertain multiple ethnic identities, oscillating between those arising from regional loyalties, those connected with the Indian subcontinent, and then those which emerge as a result of their disadvantageous position in British society. And so from a Vietnamese Londoner's perspective, these different allegiances afford, on the positive side, opportunities to connect and share community on multiple levels for mutual benefit. The basis of the formation of community was shared communication. Vietnamese selectively connected and shared with one another and others, thus constructing communities with the purpose of support and encouragement. An example of this construction of community came in the late 1980s. Lynn described her family as being part of a boat of around 100 people that set off from Haiphong. They called themselves the 101 boat, and in her story she related that everyone got on the boat, they didn't really know one another, they left Vietnam, they traveled for 2 weeks on this boat and got to Hong Kong. They waited in the harbor for a number of weeks waiting to be settled. If you've seen pictures of this time in Hong Kong, there were 100 to 200 boats stacked up out into the harbor waiting to be processed. And so her vote was finally processed. They put all 101 in the same camp, same place. Her family was, for some reason, offered a place in Hong Kong, an apartment in Hong Kong, and they refused it. I said, why? To get out of the refugee camp. And she said they didn't want to leave the 101. And I thought, that's interesting. So then finally, after some 2 years, the 101 group, minus a few who married Chinese Hong Kongers, they were moved en masse to London. 101 people. So then I asked, how many times, or did your family ever go to the refugee centers in London and access sort of the refugee support network? And she said, no, they stayed within the 101. If they needed help, they went to the members of the boat. And so I thought, this is an interesting form of attachment, a new form of attachment. It isn't about ethnicity, it isn't about who has the most resources, it's really more about attachments due to communication, due to a shared experience. And so this notion of Lynn's family made me begin to think about this idea of community. And Shepard and Rothenberg state that we should see similarity and uniqueness as resulting from communication and community, rather than viewing communication and community as products of commonality. I think this kills the notion of homogeneous units that we need to be careful of. And this reaction thus reactions against difference. Once we start thinking of commonality, we start thinking of the other. Once we think about communication, then it opens the door to multiple peoples. So once Vietnamese, so community happens in the urban setting in the midst of difference and uniqueness because of an openness to communication, dialogue, and the formation of community. So once Vietnamese in London reached a critical mass, it was possible to form community as defined above. The combining of resources of Vietnamese individuals and families made possible the establishment of multiple communities. Communication then is the glue that pulled members of the community together, and Chinese Vietnamese view themselves through these various perspectives, that of the individual, the family, the community. But in London, those perspectives have taken on new forms and opened new possibilities for attachment. Today's world, thank you, more than ever before in history, both internally and externally displaced persons find themselves on the move. And many people flee due simply to their ethnicity. And I'd argue that citizenship is not, perhaps never has been, permanent. We live in an increasingly precarious world of impermanent citizenship, and we must also live in a world of increasing connection, however. It came to me that if I were to draw a map of the globe based on places of attachment, the distances between places might look very different to the actual distances measured on a map. So on this map of attachments, let's call it, there may be likely a very short trip between London and Hong Kong for one interviewee because of their communication and connection, whereas that one individual going from London to Birmingham, a 2-hour train ride, might be as far away as Siberia. And so this is the idea that I'm trying to bring us into. So redrawing these maps through social engagement and connectivity and connection provides an opportunity to view the world very differently. As we think about serial migration, once far more precarious and irregular in reference to immigration law, can now be carried out with far less uncertainty, albeit with a sense of temporariness. As one of my interlocutors stated in reference to his parents, it's as if their bags are packed in their minds. They're ready for the next move. And as I finish, I'd like to say the varying perspectives and reactions of these Chinese background Vietnamese indicate an erosion of the power of the state to define and even disadvantage people who have lived everyday lives in multiple places as serial migrants. A transformation in the ways that some individuals interact with communities within the state is brought about by the experiences of multiple forced migrations. From an anthropological perspective, Sharma and Gupta assert that states do not give rise to cultures, but cultures give rise to states. The state is not above culture. The state is a product of culture, is my argument. This is why the state, that is the dominant culture of the community of which it's made, can declare some members, even citizens, as unacceptable and marginalized, criminalized, eject, or even murder them. The crucial point here is made by Etienne Balibar, who in his work entitled Citizenship discusses the inclusionary and exclusionary forms or nature of citizenship and concludes that it's the community itself that excludes, not only in the form of bureaucratic rules and procedures, but also in the form of the consciousness of its members, which is more or less politically motivated. But in clear terms, we would say that it's always citizens knowing and imagining themselves as such who exclude from citizenship and who thus produce non-citizens in such a way as to make it possible for them to represent their own citizenship to themselves as a common belonging, that is, citizenship over and against the other. So, as I conclude, the community inclusion and exclusion are at the basis of the movement of hundreds of thousands of boat migrants and others setting out over land. Riffing on Johan Hendry's unpublished paper entitled Rethinking Security, I propose that it's necessary to rethink the binaries of notions of inclusion and exclusion with regard to community and citizenship. It seems time to move toward an acceptance of the ways in which people are included and excluded as different forms of attachment. During 40 years of settlement in the London context, Chinese background Vietnamese have experienced both acceptance and rejection. Perhaps eventually more recent arrivals, such as Syrians, Somalis, Sudanese, North Africans, Rohingya, and Tamil refugees will also experience exclusion on various levels. But in the midst of these experiences, will maintain dialogue and communication within communities in which inclusion is also experienced. This research is pointing to the lived reality that the urban, ethnically diverse communities of London provide spaces of security in the midst of multiple and ongoing experiences of insecurity. And that it is from this base of security that further migration and movement become possible, thus redrawing the global map such that that distant communities become neighbors and next door neighbors drift far into the distance. Thank you.
Undergrad at UC Merced. I'm so glad to be here with all of you to present my exciting research. And this project was funded through the Andrew Mellon Foundation. This was a faculty mentored project during the summer, and I'm also continuing this project with my current professor. So I'm going to begin by when I first started my research, I was really interested in how music and emotion how music evoked emotion. And this was something that I was really interested in because a lot of the literature in psychology has looked at that. And particularly Kollinak, she argues that music is essential in motion picture and film. She says that it aids in the expression of space, time, and location, as well as providing feeling and atmosphere in the film, and also aiding in the developmental and plot progression. But what I was particularly interested in, as I just said, was the ability for music to elicit emotions, and that is something that she really emphasized. And so I really wanted to look at this more in depthly, so I did gather a lot from my literature review, and we know that music is highly connected to the body. And we know that parts of the body react to music, so some of the parts include the insula, the cingulate cortices, the ventral striatum, amygdala, and the upper brain subnuclei, and all these parts of the brain are associated with emotional. Our emotional state reacts to the music. And so we know that also that when we listen to music, it also activates the areas of the brain when we do other activities such as eating food, participating in sexual activity, and also for addiction as well as substance abuse and drug abuse. Moti looked at music from a developmental psychology perspective, and he identified that children use tempo to identify certain emotional associations. So like the slow tempo or fast tempo, it's either sad or happy. And then we also know that music is good at retrieving autobiographical memories. For example, if I hear music from my childhood, I'm more likely to remember some aspect of my childhood. And then one study looked at how music serves as a mood management, meaning that when we hear music, our mood changes. And so this study looked at, I think, surgery patients, and music helped relieve pain within the surgery patients compared to the control group who didn't receive any music. And so, at first I was interested in examining musical elements and how they elicited emotion, but because there was so much literature within looking at music and emotion, I wanted to look at how there's different elements in political advertising that evokes emotion. And so my main research question was, through an interdisciplinary and multidimensional framework, what other elements make an advertisement politically and emotionally provoking, and then how do these various elements provoke emotion? So what I did is I collected 3 politically oriented commercials. I selected them based on how relevant they were to the political climate. And these were also like 3 very popular ones that came right before and a little bit after the Trump administration. And so the 3 ads that I collected were called Carry by Cadillac, which is what I'll be focusing on today. Due to the time constraints, I will only be able to present one and also just a few of the elements that I found. And then the other 2 were Equality by Nike and then The Journey by Jarritos. So how I conducted the content analysis was I created a table sheet and I listed each shot by the time, the transcription of the voice, narration, the description of the shots, the film color, the music, the sound, and emotion, and a snapshot. So these are all the multi-sensory elements that I looked at specifically, but I also gathered a lot of other information by repeatedly watching the videos, and this was something that I really kind of enjoyed. And so you can tell that it took a lot of work in terms of looking at each shot, and these were only about 2 to 3 minutes. And so before I show you the advertisement that I'm going to focus on today, I do want to define what political advertising is, because I think it's very important. There's a variety of political advertising. And the advertising that I focused on is not trying to persuade voters to vote for a politician. Rather, the ads that I focused on looked at how an ad responds to a political climate and administration, and how it sparks political debate depending on the political climate that we're in. And so it did take a political stance and view and perspective. All the 3 ads were a little bit more progressive, just because there was a lot of hateful rhetoric within the Trump administration. So the ad that I will be showing you is called Carry by Cadillac, and I do just want to provide a short description. And so it's an ad that really evokes how we should carry each other during tough political times. And so we see images of protests and marches, equality signs, and images of times when other people have helped each other out. So this concept of carrying each other forward, moving into a better direction, is what this ad is trying to do in order to help us heal from political divisions. But before I show you the ad, I do want to let you know, do pay attention to the elements that I looked at, just from face value, and think about how this ad evokes your emotions. Look at the camera movements, for example, or the specific symbolism, the music, the sounds, the film color, the images, and then lastly, the voice narration.
This chasm between us. But what they don't tell you, what doesn't make the news, is this. We carry each other forward. No matter who we are, or what we believe, or where we come from. We've had the privilege to carry a century of humanity. Lovers, fighters, leaders. But maybe what we carry isn't just people, it's an idea.
One of the things that I focused on, and something that you probably clearly saw, and one of the elements that I found was how the ad uses social movements to make this very political. And so we can think of the civil rights movement, for example, and if you look at how the pictures of the civil rights movement, you often see a black and white imagery. I don't know if you guys can recall that, but that is something that the ad incorporated into, that is an element that the ad incorporated. And so you can see the images in black and white right there. And then we also know that social movements are very important in, resisting racism, discrimination, inequality, and prejudice in the U.S. And one of the favorite quotes that I found in the literature was one by Debussy, and she states that marches have demanded social justice, more democracy, the end of segregation and racial discrimination. They serve to dramatize events, to attract and keep the attention of citizens who, for whatever reason, would not otherwise be interested in politics. So really, what Cadillac is trying to say is that if you buy one of their cars, you will somehow contribute to social change. And even though you may not, you do feel like there's an extension of the brand. So social movements is sort of an extension of Cadillac, meaning that we can associate social movements with Cadillac, particularly looking at this ad. And then these imagery of the ads also portray current social political movements. So we can think of the Women's March on Washington, which recently happened in January, which I believe was the largest social movement or march that happened. And then also the Black Lives Matter movement, which we see in 17 seconds of the ad. And this image is really quite striking because we often don't see this happening. Usually we see police officers kill blacks at alarming rates. And so I also want to focus on how the Cadillac ad really evoked this word carry and how they demonstrated that. And we can see carry used as a metaphor, and we can see it used in different senses in the ad, such as, denoting progression, to carry each other forward. Also, we can see that the word carry is matched with a lot of images of people actually carrying objects or people physically carrying another person. And so I started to think about this more philosophically, and I really think that this also demonstrates protesters, they march forward their values, their views, their activism, their energy, but they also carry with them an untold story of struggle and hardship. In essence, protesters are carried by the march. And so, for instance, these pictures do demonstrate how carry is used as a metaphor. For instance, people are carrying signs. President Eisenhower is being carried by the automobile. And then we see people carrying injured players or soldiers, or a man being airlifted by a helicopter, or an immigrant carrying a sign. So this is how carry is demonstrated. And then another thing that I looked at was the sign of resistance, strength, and power, the raised or clenched fist. This is a very common symbol that we usually see in social movements. In fact, I went to downtown Santa Barbara yesterday, and I don't know if you guys noticed, but the Special Olympics flags out there, the man is doing that clenched symbol. I thought that was interesting. But in shots 5 to 6, the viewers see a raised or clenched fist, and we know that this fist has been used, like I said, as a symbol of resistance, and it was originally used in the Black Panther movement. And so these are some of the imagery that I collected where we see the clenched fist. So in the women's liberation movement, the Black Lives Matter, the gay liberation movement, the Chicano movement, and then just recently the NFL started using this symbol as well. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to share with you all of the elements that I found between all three ads. And so this is just sort of a summarization of what I found. So like I said, they incorporated black and white imagery. The timing of release was very important because it was a little bit before, a little bit after the Trump administration. Each ad started with a fearful feeling and with a hopeful feeling. And then also what I found in terms of the music was that instruments were added, and then there was this like tension, and then it was released at the end. And then there was also a focus on human faces. As we know, a lot of developmental psychologists have demonstrated that we use the face to really look at people's emotions, particularly infants. They are drawn to the face. And then progressive social movements as an extension of the brand. Meaning that the brand, you're not just buying the brand, but you are buying sort of another political aspect of it, something that makes you feel like you're contributing to politics. Another important element that I found that I really want to focus on was the lyrical voice narration, and I really felt like they became like political speeches. And there was a scholar that I read, he wrote The Voice in Cinema by Michael Shion, and he states that the physical nature of film necessarily makes an incision or a cut between the body and the voice, and that we sort of expect the voice to match the body. And so when we watch film, you know, if we hear a voice but we don't see the body, we expect them to sort of match based on, you know, stereotypes. So for instance, a man is supposed to have a masculine or a rugged voice, or a female is supposed to have a feminine voice. And so I really looked at my ads, and I argue that there's also a connection between the narrator's voice and also the identities of the actors portrayed in the ads. So for instance, in the ad that I looked at, which I showed today, the narrator's voice we expect to match with the actors, with the narrators being an individual in a politically divisive and charging nation. The other two ads I focused on was being Black in America and being an immigrant. They focused on those two aspects, and so we also noticed that, well, I noticed that the narrator is not just simply a person talking, but that person's also trying to evoke, look, I'm a Black person, or look, I'm an immigrant, and so that really is something that we hear in the voice. It's not just another person talking, or just simply a narrator talking. And so my final argument is that it's not just music that evokes emotion, but it's really all of these elements, multi-sensory elements, which are situated in all of these subject areas that evokes emotion. And so my analysis of politically oriented advertising relies upon integrated theory, combining humanistic and social scientific perspectives within sociology, psychology, ethnomusicology, visual art, literature, and history. And I argue that political advertising blends all these elements together to form, persuade, and pitch a cohesive political message, and to sell both their brand and a particular political ideology. And so I was originally in the panel of narrating how the community is narrated, or sorry, what was the panel? It was narrating communities, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so I really wanted to tie it to my research, and so I think it's very important to be media literate. And so as I was, you know, doing content analysis on these ads, I really had to deconstruct these ads. And so I really learned how to look at ads and really look at all the different elements. And I think it's a very important skill. And so I think that it would be wonderful if we could sort of teach these things to our communities, and to sort of look at these ads and see if they are, you know, representative of our communities. I think it's important to effectively criticize the media, especially for those ads that portray marginalized and disadvantaged populations, and also to raise certain questions like, did the communities have any involvement or voice in the creation of these advertisements? Or what are the hidden messages of the ads, and what is it really saying about our communities? But most importantly, and I think that all of you guys can take from these ads, is that it really brings about political discussion about really important topics that are very important. So, such as race and gender, immigration and LGBTQ rights and human rights. And also these ads really respond to the political climate. So they also affect, our political perspectives and how we want to want to provoke that social change in our communities. And so that ends my presentation. I do want to acknowledge the IHC Center for having me here, but also the UROC Center at UC Merced, the UROC Humanities grant, which was funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and then as well as my faculty mentor.